professor of Filipino here at USF. I'd like to give you Jay Gonzalez, chair of the Philippine Studies program, to welcome you to today's event.
I'd like to welcome everybody to this very important event here at USF. We are very proud of the Philippine Studies program to be hosting this event. We love to bring community to our classroom, and we love to bring our classroom to the community. So both these are what we are known for here in USF Philippine Studies. I'd like to welcome the veterans for being here. It's always very emotional for me to see veterans because I have two grandfathers on both sides who fought World War II and did I have three grandfathers, two who passed away in the Bataan death march. So it's it's quite touching for me to see the veterans. It reminds me of where I came from. And we have a saying in the Philippines, right? Ang hindi lumingon sa pinanggalingan, hindi makakarating sa paroroonan. The person who doesn't know how to look at his or her past will never reach the person's life destination. So with that, I'd like to welcome you again, and Professor Bourbon will introduce Cecilia Gerland.
Cecilia Gerland is a Berkeley playwright and novelist, and most of her plays are rooted in history. Her first play, Children of the Damned, was about the plight of Amerasian children born from Filipino women and American servicemen stationed in the Philippines. Her other plays tackle issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in a play about St. Francis of Assisi, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Medicis of Florence, and the Spanish Civil War. Cecilia's latest play is based on her debut novel, In Her Mother's Image. She has copies over there in the back. And it's the story of an estranged mother and daughter and the emotional toll of war on a Filipino family. That's also available on YouTube, in case you'd like to look up on Amazon. Cecilia is currently writing a one-man show entitled Breach of Faith, The Men of Bataan, which is based on her interviews with Bataan veterans. During the past year, Cecilia has been spreading awareness of the legacy of Bataan. So for today's presentation, I give you Cecilia.
Thank you, Edith. I'd like to thank Jay Gonzalez and Professor Edith Bourbon for hosting this forum. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here with us today to listen to what our veterans did during World War II. Now, how many of you have heard of the Bataan Death March? Okay. Do you have any relatives who fought during Bataan Death March in Bataan? Good. It's very encouraging because during the past, I did a presentation at the University of Hawaii, I think in February this year, and a lot of them were of Filipino descent, and not too many people heard about Bataan. So it's very encouraging that there's a lot of you here who have heard about Bataan. Let me just go through my second. Why am I here? I'm here because of my father, Luis Guerra Jr. My father was a soldier. He was drafted in September 1941, just a few months before the outbreak of war with Japan. And when we were growing up in the Philippines, when I was a child growing up in the Philippines, I used to hear stories about the war from my father. But the way he told the stories was kind of like describing a cowboy movie. It was exciting, it was funny because he had sound effects and all these descriptions. And then later on, many years later, as an adult, I was inspired to write a novel in her mother's image. It actually started life as a screenplay, then it became a novel, and now it's a stage play. But it was based on stories from my parents who were there during World War II. And the premise of the book is how the war is perceived by a child. I had an aunt who was 8 years old during the war. And so the novel, it's fiction, but the whole war is seen through the eyes of an 8-year-old child, and how this child suffers the emotional toll of war. Not only the child, but the entire family. And so it goes back and forth between 1971, when she's 38, and when she was 8 years old. And she goes back to the Philippines in 1971, and she's confronted by the beatings that she suffered, the events that she suffered during World War II. So my father inspired me to write this. And here he is now at 93 years old. He's still alive. But, while I was doing my presentations for the novel, I discovered that not too many people knew about Bataan. And so I started making this presentation. It was more based on the book than Bataan. And then I started doing research about Bataan. And that's when I found out what happened to my father and the generation of men who served in Bataan and Corridor and in the Philippines. So, but let me backtrack to 1935. As you all know, the Philippines became an American colony in 1898 after the Spanish-American War, and the Philippines, along with Cuba and other Spanish colonies, were sold to the United States for $20 million. So the Philippines was a colony, and then in 1935, the Tidings-McDuffie Act, actually 1934, was passed in Congress, providing for the establishment of a Philippine Commonwealth Army in preparation for its eventual independence in 1946. So, Manuel Quezon, who was the president of the Commonwealth, and General Douglas MacArthur actually met each other in 1905 when they were young men. Because General MacArthur's father, Arthur MacArthur, became the Governor General of the Philippines at that time. And so when President Quezon became president of the Commonwealth, Philippine Commonwealth, he asked General MacArthur, who was retiring as Chief of Staff of the United States, he was the United States Chief of Staff, to become the Field Marshal of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, as well as its military advisor, in charge of setting up an army. So confident was MacArthur of his defense plan that in 1936, he declared in a speech that the underlying principle of his plan, of the plan, was to create a defensive force of such strength to make an invasion so costly in lives and money that no chancellery in the world, if it accepts the opinions of the military and naval staffs, will ever willingly make an attempt to willfully attack the Philippines. So, war was actually not unexpected, because in 1931, as you all know, Japan occupied Manchuria. And then in 1937 was the Second Sino-Japanese War, and you've heard, of course, of the rape of Nanking. I'm sure you've heard of that. And then in December 1937, the Japanese sunk a U.S. gunboat called Panay in the Yangtze River. So the air was rife with tension. They knew war was coming. And as a matter of fact, in the Philippines, in June of 1941, they were preparing for blackouts. In July 1941, Japanese vessels have been sighted 200 miles off the coast of the Philippines, between the Philippines and Formosa. So they were expecting war. But what happened was as of July 1941, July 22, 1941, when Japan occupied French Indochina, the US declared total embargo on Japan, scrap iron and oil, and they froze all the Japanese assets in the United States and the Philippines. And a few days later, on July 26, President Roosevelt signed a declaration ordering the Philippine Commonwealth Army into the service of the United States, and it became the U.S. Armed Forces of the Far East. The problem was, in July, I think only 20% of the targeted Army Corps had been recruited, and they were not trained. It was a volunteer army. And so recruitment only started in August or September of 1941, just a few months before the war. And then in July 30th, 1941, an American gunboat, Tutuila, was bombed by the Japanese in Chongqing, China. And so at this point, there were no negotiations. There was a delegation, a Japanese delegation in Washington, D.C., negotiating, negotiating, because they didn't want to go to war, but actually they were preparing for war. They had better maps than the Philippine Army, because at that point, there was actually a huge business community, Japanese business community in Baguio in the north and Davao in the south. And at that point, this was documented, this was part of the book. A lot of Japanese spies were going around the Philippines, actually mapping out the place. So when the war happened, they actually had better maps than the Philippine Army. So what was the defense plan of MacArthur? Since 1898 until the war happened, there was a defense plan called War Plan Orange, number 3, which called for the prolonged defense of the Philippines from the peninsula of Bataan, which is the gateway to Manila Bay. But General MacArthur thought it was a defeatist plan because they had to withdraw to Bataan until aid from the United States, until reinforcement from the United States would come. So General MacArthur and his staff was able to replace it with Rainbow Plan, which called for meeting the enemy in the beaches. So now, the situation, I'm going to talk about the situation between December 8th, which, as all of you know, Pearl Harbor happened, until the end, April 8th, before the surrender.